afternoon. Welcome to the second seminar, and today I will share with you my talk about sharing sacred spaces in Jerusalem between contestation and tolerance. My name is Yitzhak Reiter. I am a professor of Islam, Middle East Studies, and Israel Studies. I chair the Israel Studies department at Ashkelon Academic College, and for this fall semester I'm a visiting professor to Emory University. I would like today to speak about my research. My main focus on the research on holy places is about how to prevent violent outbreaks at shared holy places. And once they break out, how to control them and even how to mitigate and resolve them. I will speak today about two case studies of my research. One of them pertains to the Temple Mount, Al-Haram al-Sharif in Arabic, or Al-Aqsa Mosque according to the Muslims. The other case study is about the Western Wall, also the two holiest sites in Jerusalem. The two of them are located in Jerusalem. As you know, Jerusalem is a cradle of religions, Judaism, Christianity, and it is the third holiest place in Islam. It used to be a symbol of interfaith and cohabitation, but at the same time, it was also a venue of contestation. Yet, there are records during medieval times that show that holy places in Palestine were shared by different denominations without any dispute, in tolerance. So the question is, what went wrong in modern times? My answer is that today sovereignty matters. In the past, when during 400 years of Ottoman rule, everybody knew who's the sovereign. It was the Ottoman Sultan. Nobody questioned the possession or the ownership of the sovereignty of the place. So in that situation, Druze, Muslims, Christians, Jews, others could share a holy place because they did not demand any political stance or any political possession or sovereignty as we have it in modern times. The Ottomans, who ruled for these 400 years in Palestine between the 16th century and World War I, they invented the millet system. Millet system is actually a system that gives the different religious denominations a semi-autonomous right to administer their own things. And at the same time, the Ottomans also invented the status quo system. Status quo system actually began in the 19th century when a dispute broke out between the Greeks and Latins at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. The dispute actually resulted with a formation of a commission of inquiry that the Sultan formed in order to study the case and understand how to solve it without entangling his political situation with the European powers at that time. Because at that time, each European power, be it Russia, who supported the Greek Orthodox, or France, who supported the Franciscans, each of the European powers supported this or that church. The result of this commission of inquiry was that the Sultan imposed a new situation. The situation at holy places, the shared holy places, was frozen at a given time in history, which is 1982, and then 1986 it became official. And since then, every religious group knows what are their rights and duties in a place, and what are the conduct that they can use in the places. The status quo was applied first to 7 Christian denominations in Jerusalem and 7 Christian holy places in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And then it was extended during British Mandate to encompass also the Western Wall, the Tomb of Rachel, and other places. So the status quo, since it was created by a government, be that the Sultan, was actually freezing the rights at a given moment, meaning that you establish hegemony or exclusivity in some cases of one denomination over the others. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, as an example, the Orthodox Greeks gained the upper hand. But at the same time, the status quo discriminates against minority groups that are only awaiting for the first opportunity of change of gods to retain their own claims. We have examples of how the status quo actually was not a frozen moment. The status quo, is it a standstill situation? No, it is dynamic. 2 examples come to my mind now. One of them is the metal detectors crisis in Jerusalem last year, when the Israelis had to install them due to a terror action resulted with the killing of 2 policemen at the Temple Mount compound. So you have here an example of how terror calls for the change of status quo and install some security facilities. Another example is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. During the Friday fire ceremony, the Greek and the Armenians and others are involved in this ceremony, and there is a congestion of visitors, of pilgrims to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that is why the Israeli police positioned flat screens outside of the church in order to visitors to see it from afar without putting themselves in a situation that they will have to use violence and so on. Now, my first example that I would like to discuss and analyze together with you is the Temple Mount Al-Haram al-Sharif site. One could not expect that after 2,000 years of banning the Jews from accessing the holiest site, they will resume this sort of discrimination. That is why when Israel took over East Jerusalem in June 1967, at the beginning the Israelis decided that the Haram al-Sharif will not be used for Israeli prayer, for Jewish prayer, but the administration of the site will remain in the hands of the Muslim Waqf authorities by Palestinian clerks who are subordinated and they are on the payroll of the Jordanians. So there were some changes that took place in the Holy Sepulchre. Israel took over the security, the responsibility of policing and security, while the administration was kept in the hands of the Muslims. However, the non-Muslims, for the first time, had regained the right to visit this holy site. Israel kept the keys to 1 out of 10 gates of entrance to the holy site, the gate of the Mughrabi ramp, which is to this very day used for the access, or as Jews usually say, to ascend to the Temple Mount. Um, the status quo in 1967 was a separation of functions. It was not a division of the place, but functions were divided. Security in the hands of Israel, and administration and ongoing conduct at the hands of the Muslim Waqf. And continuous dialogue developed between the Waqf and the Israeli police. This status quo lasted for at least 30 years, and it worked pretty well. With that, there were some ups and downs during this period. There were some actions, some provocations, but due to this dialogue, continuous dialogue, the parties were able to overcome them. Yet, in the last 20 years, there is a dramatic change that results with crisis. There is a group of religious nationalists, most of them are settlers of the West Bank, who are coming and challenging the halachic ruling of the chief rabbinate of Israel. The halachic ruling says that Jews are not allowed to ascend to the Temple Mount and visit it because it is the Holy of Holies and they could not defile this holy place. And it backed the government's resolution of 1967 that if Jew wants to visit and to pray at the Temple Mount, not to visit but to pray at the Temple Mount, he will be ushered to the Western Wall. And the Western Wall, in fact, developed as the substitute to the Temple Mount. So here we have this new situation that some radical groups among the Jews are challenging the status quo of 1967. They are flocking the Temple Mount in numbers. They call to each rabbi to ascend by himself to the mount and to call to his followers to ascend to the Temple Mount. From a Muslim point of view, it creates anxiety because they see these growing numbers of, I call them ideologist visitors, who come not only with an attempt to provoke and pray at the Temple Mount, but also they come with this ideology that one day the third temple will be rebuilt on top or in place of the Dome of the Rock. And we have here an example of how the religious nationalists succeeded in recruiting large numbers among the Israelis. And today, public opinion polls show that most Israelis are supporting the idea that the Temple Mount will be under Israeli sovereignty. But note here, if you ask them, why are you for an Israeli sovereignty or Israeli visit to the Temple Mount, they will say not because of religious devotion, but because we would like to retain Israeli sovereignty and possession of the Temple Mount. This is an example of how political engineering of religious symbols works. So I would say that had the Israelis not advocate for worship at the Temple Mount or for having sovereignty at the Temple Mount, they may have more rights, even perhaps, if not now, at least in the future, to pray at the Mount. And I will come back to it during my concluding part. Yes, on the other side of the aisle, as you see now, there is the Muslim Waqf and the Muslim community that is provoking, and there are extremist Muslims who claim that as long as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, this is the name that they give to the Temple Mount, is in the hands of the Jews, it is in danger. They are invoking incitement, they invoke violence, and there is here a case of radicals in both parties, across the aisle, radical Jews and radical Muslims who are in an alliance to change the status quo and to create provocations that result in tensions. That said, I must say that given all of this tension, and given the fact that the Temple Mount is actually the symbol of the conflict in the Middle East today, it is the most delicate place where Israeli Jews and Palestinian Muslims and others are contesting each other in a dispute. Given all of these circumstances, still there is a level of cooperation. There is a policy of the Israeli police of live and let live. Let us work together. Let us collaborate. Let us have a continuous dialogue in order to prevent crisis at the site. There is a functional division, as I said. There are some agreed upon arrangements like visitation hours in designated times agreed upon, like who is doing what, the dress code, who is in charge of guarding, of ushering, of every small detail between the Israelis and the Muslims. My conclusion regarding the Temple Mount example are the following. First, separate between politics and sovereignty. As I said before, sovereignty creates the problems. I am sure that Jewish devotees, had they, as in the past, not reclaimed sovereignty, they would gain more rights of access and perhaps even worship at the place, particularly in the future. The second conclusion is, do not act unilaterally. Do everything in dialogue, because once you do something unilaterally, you create angry at the other side and counteraction. I can give you one example. In 2005, when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, there was a lot of tension, even in Jerusalem. There was a fear that Muslims will infiltrate during the night over the houses close to the Haram and create provocations on the Temple Mount and perhaps even stone the Jews who pray at the Western Wall. It was a silent agreement to this between the police and the Waqf authorities to build a fence over these houses that exist to this very day, and nobody heard about it. I think that now that I share it with you, you are the first ones who know about it, beyond the police and the Waqf. The third point of my conclusion is that we have to preserve the post-1967 status quo that worked pretty well in the 30 years until 1996. Particularly, we have to restrict the number of ideological visitors in order not to offend the Muslims and keep peace on this site. Well, there is much more to conclude from this example, but I will not do it now. Otherwise, we will not read my book, right? Now, I would like to move to my second example, which is the Western Wall. The Western Wall is contested between Jews and Muslims, no doubt about it. If you remember what happened in 1929, the riots that broke out, the massacre of 133 Jews in Hebron, Safat, around Jerusalem and elsewhere, you know that it was a place of contestation, and the Muslims still to this very day keep the tradition and the claim that the Western Wall is named Al-Buraq Wall, meaning that it is holy to the Muslims as well. But I'm not going to speak today about the Jewish-Muslim contestation, because we are beyond this. The Palestinian Authority long away acknowledged that this is a Jewish site. But I would like to speak about an intra-Jewish conflict, a conflict that broke out between different Jewish streams and groups. Nobody knows exactly when Jews started to worship in front of the wall. Some say during the 12th century, some say during the 16th century, some say even beyond. But one thing is sure, that the Western Wall at one point of time became a place of individual lamentation, underlying individual. The Jews did not come and make an official service at the place. The Western Wall until recently, until 1967, was not functioning as a synagogue. It was a place, as I said before, of Jewish individual lamentation, with one exception. During the 9th day of Ab, of the month of Ab, the commemoration of the mourning of the destruction of the first and second temples, Jews came in bigger congregations and prayed in front of the wall. In 1967, Israel developed the Western Wall as a substitute to the Temple Mount. As I said before, if you are a Jew and wanted to pray at the Temple Mount, you would be ushered not only by signs, but also by policemen who will tell you, go and pray in front of the Western Wall. But Israeli authorities also decided immediately after the war to demolish the Mughrabi house. The houses which were close to the pavement were the small pavement, which was only 4 meters wide and 20 meters long, and to demolish these houses in order to prepare the way for a huge plaza in front of the wall, to turn it into a central place of worship to the Jews, as I said before, replacing the Temple Mount, because in spite of the fact that it is only the outer wall of the temple, it is the only remnant, only historical remnant of the temple compound. Israel also expropriated officially the wall. It dug a tunnel along the wall, and archaeological excavations were conducted on the southern part of the wall. The Western Wall developed as a national convention site. It is a place of commemorations. It is a place of where soldiers swore in. It is also a place where, when the leaders of other countries or world leaders come and visit Israel, they are visiting the Western Wall as government guests. So it is not only a place of religious worship, but also a place of national symbol for Israel. The first debate regarding the wall occurred exactly after the wall was liberated by the Israeli forces. The debate was about whether to put or not to put a divider between men and women, to separate men and women as is conducted at Orthodox synagogues or not. After deliberations in the government, it was decided that it will be handed over to the Ministry of Religious Affairs, meaning that a religious minister of the Orthodox stream will be in charge in consultation with the chief rabbis of Israel. In other words, an Orthodox conduct, an Orthodox status quo was imposed on the wall, and a divider was positioned to separate between men and women. Another issue was who is in charge of the wall. The Israeli government couldn't hand it over to the Antiquities Authority because it is a place of antiquities. But after pressure from the religious party at the time, who was a member of the Israeli coalition, it was decided that it will be handed over to the rabbis. And today we have a rabbi who is in charge of the Western Wall. Speaking about the Western Wall, here again, like in the case of the Temple Mount and Haram, a dramatic change took place in recent years. 30 years ago, a group of women activists who were inspired by the feminism, particularly the American feminism, decided to change the conduct at the wall. At one point of time, when there was a convention of feminist groups from Israel and from America in Jerusalem, they decided to go to the wall and pray on the first day of the month. They wanted to send a revolutionary message to the Israeli society. We want to change the mindset of Israelis. We want to explain to the world that we as women have the same rights and duties like men. And we will do it in the central place of Judaism, in the central place of conservativeness in the religious domain. We want to read from the Torah. We want to wrap ourselves with talit, the prayer shawl, and we want to conduct the tefillin ritual like men. And in addition to this, we would like to conduct bat mitzvah ceremonies for girls on equal footing like the bar mitzvah for the boys, meaning reading for the Torah. So the ritual will be meaningful. And this message that they, for the last 30 years, are doing every month, was met with an outcry by the Orthodox at the Western Wall, and particularly the ultra-Orthodox groups. In addition to the women of the wall, the reform and conservative streams of Judaism, the non-Orthodox stream of Judaism, also claimed a stake at the wall. And after the liberation of the government in the year 2000, the government assigned a small, modest place, not at the historic wall, but at the southern part of the wall, hidden off-site, first to the conservatives, and then when the women of the wall demanded their own place of worship, and they appealed to the court, then the government decided that they will have a platform, a place in what is called the Robinson Arch, or the archaeological park of Jerusalem, that they will be able to pray in mixed men and women congregations and conduct bat mitzvah and bar mitzvah rituals, as well as pray there and read from the Torah, but not in the historic wall where the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox pray. I say that the place that was allocated to the non-Orthodox streams is an inferior place. And why is it? First of all, it is hidden. It is beyond the Mugrabi ramp. The Orthodox cannot see it. Second, it is an archaeological park. It is not a place where you can feel the same as you feel at the historic wall. Third, it is a lower place. It is not on the same level as this wall. So the women of the wall could conduct the prayer first at the women's section. They were allowed to pray at the women's section across the divider of the man, and but with one exception: they could not read from the Torah scroll. What they did in reaction, in some cases, they infiltrated small Torah scrolls in their purse, as you can see in this picture of a bat mitzvah girl who's reading from the Torah. This resulted with detention of the leaders of the women of the wall. The detentions enraged the American jury and the Israeli public at large. And the women of the wall gained more support. Here, the non-Orthodox streams, the conservatives and Reform and modern Orthodox came in, and they joined forces together. And at one point of time, when the Israeli government, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, understood that this is a very delicate issue and it can endanger the relation between Israel and the diaspora, between Israel and American Jewry, they decided to do something. And Prime Minister Netanyahu nominated Natan Sharansky, who was the head of the Jewish agency, to find a solution by negotiating with the stakeholders, all the stakeholders, including the Orthodox people. He came with a solution, very interesting solution. He said that we can designate and assign to the non-Orthodox, including the women of the wall, a second kotel, a second western wall, south of the western wall, the place that I said before, that I mentioned as an inferior place, but to allocate them an equal footing by size, height, administration, and budget. Then Avichai Mandelblit, who was asked by the government to study the plan and to negotiate with the Orthodox parties and ultra-Orthodox parties, came out with a different plan. His plan was more modest than the Sharansky plan. The platform is not the same size, not the same level, and so on and so forth. But the liberal streams, including the women of the wall, agreed to it. Why? Because it gave them an official standing at the wall. They will be recognized as equal, on an equal footing, like the Orthodox streams. And they could conduct bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, and they believe that they will become more popular had they develop their own Western wall. Then Netanyahu brought in a renowned architect, Michael Arad, who is known for planning the Ground Zero Memorial, and who also submitted a new plan, very ambitious plan, interesting plan, in collaboration with the liberal streams. I must say that not all, before this, 6 months after the government resolved to the plan that I showed to you right now, the government put a hold on this resolution because the ultra-Orthodox parties regretted their consent and they disagree with the plan, and to this very minute the plan was not implemented. But the government, Prime Minister Netanyahu, is making an attempt, in order not to enrage more the American Jewry, to try to establish a more respectful platform at the site and to expand it under the disguise of accessibility arrangements, and to allow them to have their own place. Also, because there is the court ruling that is pending and expects that the government will provide a respectful and decent place for worship at the wall. So a provisional platform was constructed at the place, and recently Prime Minister Netanyahu is planning to change the situation. But when he announced it, Minister Uri Ariel reacted by saying, well, the Western Wall doesn't belong to the Prime Minister. He cannot decide on it. It is in the hands of the chief rabbis. So let us wait and see what the politics will bring. In closing, I began my presentation by sharing with you my following questions. First of all, how can we prevent the outbreak of violence in a holy place, in a shared holy place? And once a conflict broke out, how can we contain it and even resolve it? In my book, which is titled Contesting Holy Places in Palestine and Israel, I developed a set of 15 conflict resolution methods that could be classified into 4 categories. The first is preventive measures, such as conducting continuous dialogue. The second is dispute controlling methods, such as transparency of works and of plans. The third set of conflict resolution is dispute treatment and mitigation, such as mediation as an example. And the fourth one is methods of conflict resolution. And here I would like to use, in conclusion, 3 basic methods. One is space sharing. As the women of the wall are doing today in the women's section. You can see it in the yellow mark in the slide. The second is time sharing. This is also something they are doing in the women's section. The women, speak about the women of the wall. The third one is expanding the holy space and reallocating it to different groups. In other words, to slice the cake and keep it complete. This is the resolution of the government of Israel of today. In the case of the women of the wall, the time sharing is the current situation. But I would like to, in closing, to refer particularly to the one solution that I would suggest that was never considered in the past and never discussed, which is to allow the non-Orthodox streams and the women of the wall and all and everybody, every Jew who wants to pray in front of the wall, but not in the Orthodox conduct, to do it in the upper plaza of the Western Wall. This is a place where today men and women mingle. It is a place where sometimes, such as twice a year, there is a priest prayer in the place, Birkat Kohanim, they call it. So it is a holy place. It is part of the Western Wall Plaza. You are facing the wall. You can leave your place at the upper plaza and go and touch the wall if you like. And you are not praying in an inferior place, hidden off sight, and in an and cause damage to the archaeological park there. This is something that I believe that the ultra-Orthodox will never agree to. But, I'm optimistic. You just have to see and wait and see. Perhaps there will be one day that in future government of Israel, their ultra-Orthodox parties will not part of the government coalition, and there will become the day that the government will be able to use its sticks on the one hand and carrots on the other hand in order to impose a more reasonable solution for non-Orthodox Jews and to compensate and repair and correct some faults from the 1967 period. And with semi-happy note, I would like to thank you. And now, open the floor for your questions.
We do have a few questions, Professor. I want to remind everyone who's listening online that we are welcoming questions on our Facebook page. You can also share a question via email. That's info@israeled.org. First question we have: how much does your average Israeli care about the religious disputes at the Western Wall?
This is a good question. Unfortunately, the major Israeli public, particularly the seculars, do not care about it. Until recently, until the crisis of detentions, and when they become aware of the fact that it causes damage to the relationship between Israel and the diaspora Jews. So the secular Jews believe that this is an intra-religious dispute. Why should we as secular take a part of this dispute? And I think it is wrong, because after all, it touches each of us, because it is part of our democracy, part of our rights as a democratic regime.
Fantastic. We have another question. What, if anything, can Israel do to calm Muslims' concerns about the Temple Mount?
Well, I think, and I said it before, that Israel can preserve the post-1967 status quo. In other words, to resume the dialogue, to make the dialogue more significant with the Palestinians, with the Jordanians, in order to explain to them that what the tiny religious extreme groups among the Jewish society do not represent Israel. They represent themselves, they represent their own ideology. But Israel has, at one point, to take steps and not to create the impression that the Israeli government, because there is one or two ministers in the cabinet who support these marginal groups, to let them to lead the situation. The Israeli government has to take steps and to decide to particularly restrict the numbers of the growing visitation of ideological visitors in a way that the police and the Waqf ushers, the Waqf guards, will be more able to control, that they are not provoking, that they are not praying, that not doing something that according to the status quo is unacceptable.
Wonderful. We have one more question before we wrap up. What can American Jews or other Jews in the diaspora do to assist progressive Jews in Israel into establishing an egalitarian prayer space?
Well, this is a good question. I do not want to, provide some suggestions how to exert pressure on the Israeli government. I believe that the major problem here is that the government, particularly the Prime Minister, is in a catch-22 situation. He really understands the plight of the diaspora Jews. He really wants to meet and to find a compromise that everybody will be satisfied with a different arrangement at the wall. But on the other hand, he's dependent on the political support of the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox parties. So if he has to choose between the two, political survival comes first. We can only hope, those who are wishing that the situation will be more equal at the wall, we can only hope for a day that the government will not be in such a strong need for a political support of the ultra-Orthodox, or perhaps will try to use some carrots and sticks with these parties in order to bring them to consensus about future arrangements at this holiest site.
Fantastic. Any final words to wrap up?
I would like to thank you for attending this webinar, and we are all in the Center of Israel Education are looking forward to meet you again in the third webinar next month.